Welcome to today's webinar, Cities for Life, How Communities Can Recover from Trauma and Rebuild for Health, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides information to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming webinars and other information. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speaker in this webinar are those of the speaker and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Cities for Life, How Communities Can Recover from Trauma and Rebuild for Health. You can also search for event number 922-8984. I would like to acknowledge our webinar partner today, Island Press, and their partnerships manager, Jen Hawes. Founded in 1984, Island Press's mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment and to create solutions to its complex problems. Today our speaker is Jason Corburn. Jason is a professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning and the School of Public Health at the UC Berkeley. He directs the Institute of Urban and Regional Development and the Center for Global Healthy Cities at Berkeley. He also coordinates the joint Master of City Planning and Master of Public Health degree program there. His research focuses on the links between environmental health and social justice in cities, notions of expertise in science-based policymaking, and the role of local knowledge in addressing environmental and public health problems. Professor Corburn's research and practice works to build partnerships between urban residents, professional scientists, and decision makers in order to collaboratively generate policy and planning solutions that improve the qualities of cities and the well-being of residents, particularly the poor and people of color. Following his presentation, Jason will answer as many questions as time permits, as we usually do. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool located on the control panel on the right side of your screen. And so to get started today, we'll do, and welcome to 2022, the first webinar of this year. And as we usually do, we'll start with a brief poll, just asking where people in the audience are so that Jason can see that, and that also everybody in the audience can do that. So if you are having trouble responding to it, you may need to exit full screen mode and click on your response, and we'll leave this open for a few more seconds to give folks a chance to respond before we turn it over to Jason. And as always, it's an interesting geographic spread of where people are from today, and welcome to everyone here, both in the US and abroad. And we'll close it here in a second or two, and then I will share the results and we'll turn it over to Jason. So the response, quite a balanced audience today, 31% in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, 20% in the West, Midwest, and South, and 9% international outside of the United States, at least self-reported. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jason. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Michael, and Maryland Department of Planning, Smart Growth Clearinghouse, and of course, Island Press for making all this happen. Let me share my screen. And can you see that now? Is my screen up?
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm going to jump right into it. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, morning, wherever you might be. Great to see people from all over the country and some international folks joining us. I'm going to jump right into the topic of the book and the material in the book and make the case today in this talk about how we as planners and urban policymakers and activists need to think differently and more critically about what it means to promote cities for life and urban health equity. And I'll define hopefully those terms as we move forward. And really that city planning and our urban policies need to focus on both physical and social traumas that we have helped produce, we meaning planners and urban policymakers. And these traumas create chronic or what we call toxic stress. You may have heard of that term before, and it's not the everyday stress you feel driving to work or taking the train or taking that exam for my students, but this is the long-term, everyday stress that often happens, starts in utero and follows us, unfortunately, sometimes throughout our lifetimes, damages our brain, our immune systems, and really helps explain, not just in the United States, but in other countries, the inequalities we see in morbidity and mortality rates. And I'm going to focus primarily less on assessment, but more on what do we do about this? How do we change these conditions? How do we move towards greater equity and healthy and healing communities, and focus on community-driven assessments and solutions and resident and professional partnerships, focusing on both people and place. And I think that's a key theme of the book is that we must really think about our planning and policy that focuses not just on built environments, but also on people and social interactions. So here's the slide about getting the book and the discount code. Okay, back in PowerPoint. So I'm going to make the case throughout the book and today that cities can be healthy and even healing, that planning for healthy places there's a lot of advantages often in our neighborhoods and in our urban areas: economic and educational opportunities, life supporting goods and services, cultural, political expression, healthcare and treatments. Of course, we're talking a lot about that in the last couple of years, but also positive social connections, those supportive relationships among neighbors and in our communities. And those are really critical. But those benefits really depend both on where you live and how that city is governed. And this is an image you may have seen from Sao Paulo in Brazil, the favela on the left, folks living in poverty, but not by accident that these kinds of things happen. And we don't need to look to Brazil or international examples, but we can look right in our own backyards, my own area here in the San Francisco Bay Area, but I'm sure, and I know in many cities across the United States, we see this spatial inequality, and not by accident that often those folks living in the favela or the impoverished communities are crossing that fence and taking care of the children and cleaning the homes and cleaning the pools of the wealthy on the right-hand side. So planning can and has produced community trauma. And this is what I'm going to talk about today and in the book in more depth about that this is more than just individual experiences. This is the accumulation and interaction of many forms of what's called structural violence, that underinvestment, that divestment of infrastructure, housing, schools, services that support life, but also the institutions, our institutions in local government, and also the institutions of nonprofits and even our universities that have failed to protect our folks from environmental toxins, deliver life-affirming services, and do things like racist policing. And we've, of course, been talking and hearing much more about that in our communities around the United States in particular. It's also, community trauma is historical. It's talking about the legacies of inequality in the United States and globally, of colonialism, slavery, redlining, exclusionary zoning, the things that we talk about in planning, but the legacies are still with us today. stress. And I have some work of ours on redlining, historic redlining in the United States, and health outcomes in cities today. And that this is community trauma really contributes to this idea that I've talked about a minute ago about toxic stress. And again, this is that constant fear, stress, anxiety that changes our biology, it changes our brain's architecture, and really can help us understand better why we see these persistent patterns of poor health, of chronic disease, and even premature mortality. So this is just a diagram of that, what some of that toxic stress looks like. And again, just for those of you who aren't familiar with this term or the biology of stress, and this is not, again, your everyday or what we call tolerable stress, stuff that makes us upset, but we have often resources or supports around us to mitigate that, whether it's going to that meditation or yoga class, or having a therapist, or having family or friends around for support. Those resources. Toxic stress is in the absence of those supports, and this chronic stressors of our living conditions and social factors. And of course, that leads to this constant release of our stress hormones, and the health impacts that follow kind of cascade. And they look a lot like the things that are the leading killers and things that give us disability and make us susceptible even to infectious disease today. Internal inflammation, which can lead to heart disease, and visceral fat, diabetes, poor glucose regulation, hypertension, poor sleep. Like I mentioned before, damage to our brain's architecture and our ability to judge threatening situations or control impulses. So all of these things can be attributed to these community traumas. They can also even shape our what they call epigenetics, or the way our genes are expressed and how they interact with our social and environmental conditions. And we've known, actually, in the biologic sciences and increasingly in social and the professional fields like planning, that our neighborhoods matter for our health. And this is on the left, you're seeing a report from the National Academy of Sciences and Institute of Medicine that was first in 2000 and then 2010, of neurons to neighborhoods, where they really emphasized that social relations, particularly at a young age, can mitigate these stressors, and that we can't keep treating people and sending them back into the living and learning and working conditions that are contributing to trauma and stress in the first place. That we need to focus on what healing-centered places really look like, addressing those existing stressors and not just treating them, what often today is called trauma-informed, and that's critical, but also getting at the root causes, what's driving them. And importantly, a lot of the research is showing that improving social connections, again, at a young age, but throughout our lifetimes, can give a greater health benefit than changing one's diet, stopping smoking, and exercising combined. A very controversial statement, but is backed up by much science out there now, including the current Surgeon General's recent book. So combining these social supports and changing our places, so it's about people and our places, our built environment, can even also address, of course not eliminate, but address the impacts of discrimination and racism. So hopefully multiple benefits to thinking this way of healing-centered cities. So let me give you 3 concrete examples from my own work, and this is work that I go into, of course, in more depth in the chapters in the book. And seemingly disparate places, Nairobi, Kenya, Medellin, Colombia, and in Richmond, California, and the San Francisco Bay Area. And these are places where I've been working in partnership with community organizations and local government for over a decade, and was in each place really invited in by residents and by local government to help them think about a challenge they faced, a health inequity, and to work on planning and collaborative community development. Now, let me take you to Nairobi and Kenya, Eastern Africa, and I'm going to talk just today about a community called Mukuru. You see here on the bottom right. We've also been working in many other communities across Nairobi, Mathare on the top right, and on the bottom left, you see a community hard to read maybe from the slide, but called Kibera, which is often very often referenced as the largest and biggest informal settlement in Africa, or even maybe in the world. This work in Nairobi is very collaborative and is in partnership. So it's what I'm going to talk about is the roles that both I have played, my research team at Berkeley, and most importantly, community residents and nonprofit community organizations. And here's the name of some of them here that are the key partners that have made this work go and happen. And what you see in Mukuru, this community, like many informal self-built communities, is a lack of healthy infrastructure, water, sanitation, waste collection, toilets, durable housing. And this is a typical street that floods. This is the water connection. You can see it's susceptible to being punctured and contaminated and doesn't have pressure 24/7. So it's very vulnerable, and people don't get clean water and all the related infectious diseases and food contamination that can come from that. And also there's a real stigma of being in a self-built community, often called an informal settlement and sometimes even referred to as a slum. There's constant evictions. Governments are under pressure to get rid of the urban poor. And then there's also things like we're seeing here, which is the result of a fire from informal connections. People often call them illegal connections, but we like to call them informal because people need electricity, they need water, but they don't get the official services and the safe services that a utility could provide and does provide to the middle class in Nairobi. And this is Doris. And Doris is a leading activist, community member, resident of Mukuru, and she really helped raise the profile of the safety of toilets for women in Mukuru. And this became the key driver of our work around health and around the threat to safety for women and young girls in particular, not having a safe toilet, a place to wash. And she mobilized residents. Not only did she mobilize residents, she mobilized tens of thousands of women to gather information about their experiences in Mukuru, and really built an incredible social movement in Mukuru to raise this profile of this stressful, traumatic experience of unsafe toilets. This is an example of what one looks like. So they're kind of informally built. You can see with the sheet metal without locks and no lighting at night, they become very dangerous. And there's all kinds of infections, but also sexual violence that happens around these informal toilets. And Doris worked with us to gather data and also to gather the voices, importantly, of women's experience and girls' experience around these toilets. And we put that together into narrative along with mapping and more epidemiologic data on disease risk and things like that. So this is a map that we put together with our research team, collected by community residents, showing the different types of toilets. And we use this to highlight to local government and international organizations the everyday emergency that happens in this community. We showed between 1,600 and 67 people per toilet, but the sphere humanitarian standards, and for those of you not in international development, these are standards of like an emergency situation, a hurricane, an earthquake, a war, internally displaced people, and you have to set up an emergency camp right away. The maximum that they recommend is 20 people per toilet. And you can see the numbers, the everyday emergency in this community, in this city of millions of people. In this community, Mukuru has about 350,000 people. Violation for sure of human rights, but also the Kenyan Constitution, which was reformed in 2010 to guarantee every Kenyan the right to safe sanitation. Interesting thing that they put into their constitution. And that was important because Doris and her women marched and organized and filed a lawsuit. In fact, the first civil action suit against the Kenyan government, claiming that they were not delivering their constitutional right to safe toilets. And we helped with the community's knowledge to use evidence to make that case and really pressure the government to act. And one of the things that they eventually did in response was to declare Mukuru what they call the special planning area, which was a designation, first time they had done that in the country, to ensure that there was a community plan that addressed these issues, and that was from the voices of residents like Doris and others. This is some of the planning processes of young people defining where they want things to go and what their needs are from their perspective, and really lifting up the youth voice in that process. And I'm happy to report that there's now quite a bit of new development happening that came out of that special planning area report and document, from that knowledge of community members and Doris's work with women to create not just safe toilets and sanitary infrastructure, but new housing, greening, new places to play, a new water and roads. This is the declaration by the Nairobi Metropolitan Services. And the Kenyan government responded with a new national, what they call hygiene program, that was really about cleaning up communities and hiring young people. And this is an important part of the Cities for Life and Healing process. Too often in planning, we ask people to participate, and hopefully we do it well, in plans and future-oriented documents. But they don't then get to participate and get paid, economically benefit, to implement those plans. We then hire our contractors and have others do that. The change here, and I'm going to talk about in some of the other cases in the book, was that the healing work was not just being part of the co-creation, co-design, but also the implementation, often co-implementation, skill building, and getting paid economic benefit of cleaning up your own community, building roads, helping to build the infrastructure that's going to deliver safe toilets and control flooding. And you can see some of the things that have now been delivered in Mukuru, including housing and tenure for informal residents to give them security of tenure in this community. Some of the youth continuing to clean up and paint their community and deliver and communicate some of their goals of what they want this plan to ultimately deliver. And even during COVID, the response from the Kenyan government was to deliver some of these, the infrastructure and the social supports that the plan was requesting. Here's the newly paved roads. This is the head of the Nairobi Metropolitan Services opening a hospital in the community during COVID. It was incredible how fast they were able to build after years of saying we have no resources to build. Importantly, more formal and stable housing. And the UK Guardian just recently, back in November, noted that this plan, this community-led plan in Mukuru, that could be a model for all of African slum upgrading or informal settlement upgrading. So we're really excited about the future of what's possible there, although there's still many, many challenges. Let me shift now to Latin America and Medellin, and also a city with many history of trauma and stress, particularly violence. And you probably know a little bit about it or have heard about Medellin at one point being the most violent city in the world. And today, although these data here show just a 2015, this low homicide rate, today doesn't even appear in the top 100 of the most violent cities in the world. An incredible transformation over a couple of decades. And many people have been talking about this city, and our work there really is trying to understand the multiple factors that have gone into this transformation, but also a reduction in inequality, an increase in economic opportunity, and an improvement in also the built environment. So Medellin's been recognized with many awards, and the planners on the call may know quite a bit about this city, and it's often looked at as a model, and I think should be for many reasons. It's going through some challenges today. I'll talk about more, and in the book I talk about what we worked on and the changes that happened more through not so recently in the last year or two. But resident-driven planning, another theme, also happened in Medellin. And one of the responses to violence was community people coming together, also with the private sector and local government, to figure out how can we have a kind of civic response to this violence. What does that mean? And their response was not just to focus on the militarization or the illegal activities that were happening in and around Medellin, but also about how can we rebuild our communities and our neighborhoods, make them more healthy, and include those on the periphery into the fabric of the rest of the city and the benefits of city life. And they did that through these community health plans, these local health plans, a participatory budgeting process where local people got a small percentage of the city's budget to spend and plan and implement projects. Much of this work led by women and youth. And importantly, Medellin, and you may know this term social urbanism, which came about by a mayor called Sergio Fajardo, but really focused, it was a philosophy of planning and community development that really would focus on the poorest and most violent neighborhoods first in terms of both planning and implementation, and committed the most beautiful and functional projects to these same communities. So it would be like building the city's most beautiful library or museum in its most impoverished, violent neighborhood. Something rarely would happen, I think, in a wealthier country, or particularly in the United States, what they call the ethics of aesthetics. So you may have heard of how Medellin was the first city in the world to integrate the cable car, the ski lift, the Metro Cable, they call it, into their public transport system. So reducing the travel time from an hour or an hour and a half up steep hillsides to 15 minutes or 10 minutes to integrate often these the poorest neighborhoods into the fabric again of the city to access shopping and jobs and schools and other opportunities. They didn't just do that in one or two communities. It's now the Metro Cable connects many of the poorest hillside communities. And they also did something by using existing technology that we would see in any shopping mall or airport of electric escalators, and built that into the hillsides to also allow people to get easier access, particularly those elderly and youth, or those with a stroller or with a disability, to get up and down the hillside. And again, this is free and totally integrated into their public transportation system. They also did some things that were both symbolic and environmental benefits. So they took the city's waste dump here, Moravia Garden. Now it was a dump site, previously not called a garden, and turned it into a garden, the image on the right, which is now a home for native planting, species, and ecologic environmental restoration, and also job creation, where they grow flowers and other local folks are able to produce flowers and other plants, not for eating, but for mostly for aesthetics, in these greenhouses. That's that dark thing you see on the top of the right-hand image. They've taken their major highway, which runs along the valley floor, which is at the river in the valley floor. Medellin is kind of like a bowl, like a Los Angeles, where it's got steep hillsides, and then the valley in the middle is a river, which it had its major highway along that river. And they put a plan together called the River Parks Project, which would depress the highway underground and build a highway, depress the highway underground and build a park above it, and also connect both sides of the river through pedestrian bridges and parks on both sides. Very big, ambitious project, not unlike Boston's Central Artery. In fact, that was one of the inspirations of this project. And this is what it looks like today. It's a place where formerly you had a highway and people disconnected are now coming together to play and to socialize, and there's cafes and there's all kinds of things along this riverfront, and also bringing people and development, economic development, down to the center of the city. The the valley floor rather than along the hillsides, which of course contributes to sprawl and air pollution and related issues. A couple other quick projects that have happened in Medellin was planning again to take over a women's prison, which was here on the left, 100-year-old women's prison, and turning it into a public university, open to the entire community. But again, built it next to one of the poorest, most violent communities called San Javier, Comuna 13. And this is now functioning and open for the city and for folks to benefit. And the last example in Medellin is what they call the UVAs, or the life articulated units. And this is where they worked with the public utility to take water storage tanks that were scattered across the city, also on the steep hillsides, which were behind walls or fences, and take those fences down and plan them and integrate them into new public space. And again, it was often youth who were leading the planning process about what ought these UVAs look like. And there's tens of them now across the city, and they all have different functions. Some are art, some are performance spaces, some are recreation spaces. There's places to learn and play and get job training and be employed even. So they aren't just green space, they have multi-functions. And this is some images from them. And again, youth were really instrumental, bringing in culture and music and art to really shape these places and make them function for young people and their needs, and what they saw as a way to heal from the trauma and violence in that city. And here's a quote from a young person in Comuna 13 that we were working with about how music and art make public our message and their legitimacy of young people. And they say that this was the way armed groups would use their walls to mark territory, and they're redefining how walls are used and marked, reinterpreting the walls for liberation and peace. And I'm a data geek as a professor. I'm not going to bombard you with data, but what we've seen is a steep decline in gun violence as a cause of death, but unfortunately an increase in things like respiratory infections and heart disease. So again, it's an ongoing process to think about cities for life and their transformation. A final example is right here in my own backyard in Richmond, California, a city just north of Berkeley and Oakland, across the bay from San Francisco. And again, an ongoing transformation from what was one of the most polluted and unhealthy communities, a community of color, an immigrant community, but also a very interesting history of industrialization and activism. In 2007, when we first started, Richmond was the 9th most violent city in the United States based on gun violence, and the lowest life expectancy in the Bay Area. That's the 9-county Bay Area. And really asked, how could we turn this around? How could we address what we're seeing as some of those structural factors contributing to inequalities, trauma and stress and poor health in Richmond, to a healthier, more inclusive place? And of course, that had to start with community members setting the agenda, identifying stressors and solutions. And this is a series of workshops we held at schools with parent groups and in community processes around general plan update, to really get people to envision from their perspective and their life, what were the things that they thought were the chronic stressors they faced, and what could we do about those? How could we address those? Again, Richmond has a really interesting history and a somewhat of a spatial, violent history in terms of housing segregation. It was at one point had the largest federal public housing program in the United States during World War II, building worker housing and public housing around that massive industrialization. These are the Kaiser shipyards that built many warships during World War II, and Kaiser went to the southeastern part of the United States, Louisiana, Mississippi, and recruited African-American workers to come to the shipyards. 40,000 people came in 1 year to Richmond to work in the shipyards. And of course, they provided many with housing, but the housing was racially segregated between whites and African Americans and Asian Americans. This is the zoning map from that time. The triangle there is called the Iron Triangle because it's bordered by on three sides by railroad tracks, and it's all the way back to the 40s and 50s and through today really continues to struggle with spatial segregation, and it was surrounded by industrial and commercial activity with the single family zoning and the housing for the wealthier folks to what in this map is on the eastern side, the right hand side, and eventually up into the hillside outside of Richmond near the port and the bay. But Richmond also has an amazing history of activism, particularly folks of color. It's really an unknown story about the home and the birth of the Black Panther Party movement is in Richmond, responding to police violence and a shooting of an unarmed African-American man in Richmond, and also around environmental issues and some of the foundational civil rights lawsuits about inclusion in the workplace and union representation, particularly at the shipyards for African Americans. So there's a deep, deep history and expertise within the community and knowledge. But of course, the legacy of the shipyards also created massive poverty as the shipyards obviously closed after the war. Dorothy Lang is a very powerful photography exhibit on this. Much of that worker housing remained and has never maintained, and it's turned into segregated, dilapidated housing for many folks in Richmond. And poverty and inequality really set in through the 1980s with further deindustrialization and closing of industry, like many cities around the United States. And that's also contributed to environmental burdens and environmental justice issues. You can see this, the Iron Triangle, that red triangle next to that dark black polygon there, which is the Chevron oil company's largest refinery, sits in Richmond and has been there since the 1920s and continues to refine heavy crude, but also other chemicals, and has environmental impacts. You can see this is the cumulative environmental impacts statewide analysis, and Richmond and many communities in Richmond feeling that environmental injustices. So these overlapping burden of housing inequality, environmental inequality, and violence, gun violence, was identified by our residents. This is the shootings in Richmond, and you can see the concentration again in the Iron Triangle. So our task was really, how do we improve the community, but how do we also think about the needs in particularly historically burdened communities, and address the historical legacy of this inequalities and focus on both healing and health moving forward. Now, gun violence, a critical issue, not just in Richmond, but we're hearing a lot about this today. And I think what we've learned in Richmond and the organization and structure we've put in place has applications hopefully wherever you are in the world, in your city. And that what we know about gun violence is that it really can break down the whole idea of civic and public life when people feel unsafe. So our cities are often about public places, our parks, our public transport, our theaters, places where we come together and experience culture, music, and art, and each other. And when people are in fear, that begins to break down, or that breaks down entirely. But it's inequitably breaks down. Often wealthy folks, as we've seen during the pandemic, can still go out and experience nature or public space if they're able to get out of a city or access something not in a violent neighborhood. So there's a racial justice element for sure of gun violence. We know that in the United States, and we know that often even in places like Latin America, of those impacts. And those impacts are traumatic. They have left that legacy of trauma and stress, multi-generational, and they combine with those stressors of poverty and lack of infrastructure and poor education. So the shared collective space of how we can come together as communities to help people heal gets threatened or is threatened when there's gun violence. And that was what was happening in Richmond. So one of the responses to that was to create something called the first Office of Neighborhood Safety in the United States. Now there's probably 30 or 40 across the United States. And this was where in the local government created a new institution focused on peacemaking. So right next to the Parks Department and engineering and planning and reporting to the city manager was the Office of Neighborhood Safety. And it was incredibly controversial because the idea was to hire formerly incarcerated community members to be employed by the city. Now, you can't have a felony to work in most local governments. This was a major challenge. Not only that, but many of these folks came out of prison, reformed after spending years, sometimes up to 20 or more years, for a gun homicide or attempted homicide. So it's very controversial. But through years, actually, a couple of years of negotiation with the city and many others, they were able to launch this. And it was a pilot program, which has now been in place for coming up on maybe 12 or 13 years. And the idea was that it's really a small number of folks in communities across the United States and even many parts of the world who are perpetuating gun violence. And often it is the result of a series of retaliations about turf and other conflicts. And if you could reach that small number of people, the idea that communities are not violent, but there are violent folks who are in the communities often because they have been traumatized in the ways that I've discussed earlier. You can prevent and interrupt conflict if you can get to them and you can engage them. And that's what the Office of Neighborhood Safety and what they call their Peacemaker Fellowship does. So it reaches out to those at the center of gun violence. Both importantly, these are folks who are victims. And they may also be perpetrators and they've avoided capture by law enforcement for whatever reason. And they engage those people in a very intensive 18-month fellowship where they get 24-hour, 7-day-a-week mentorship, an adult to give them services, supports, what they call life skills, and create what they call a life map, a life management action plan, which really guides them and their mentor to help make better decisions and to think about what are the stressors in their communities that need to be changed. And what we've seen through a number of studies of the work in Richmond is it's reduced gun homicides, and importantly, those fellows, those participants who were at the center of gun violence, very likely to be victims or incarcerated, 94% alive, 83% no gun activity, arrests, or injuries since participating in this program. This guy in the middle here is Devon Bogan, who founded the program and is the leader. These are some of the fellows who participated, and this program is now a national organization called Advance Peace. I'll talk more about in the book. Here's James Houston, so one of the outreach workers, and here's a quote from him that I just found really powerful about what they do as outreach workers. And this is not about incarcerating people. This is about seeing their humanity, offering harm reduction services, opportunities to those who he says society has deemed expendable. See them as assets and give them that very technical term in planning and public health called love. And to see these guys talk about, giving street love is really very powerful, and it's transformed this community and what we're seeing with the Advanced Peace Program, other communities around California and the country. The data also back this up. Here's the reduction in shootings and gun homicides in Richmond. There's the launch of the Office of Neighborhood Safety. They had a couple-year startup period and really launched its Peacemaker Fellowship in 2009, 2010, and we can see that sustained reduction. It wasn't just a one-off thing, a couple of years, and then there was a spike. And in fact, even if I was to extend this to 2020 and 21, where we're seeing spikes in gun violence across the United States, including Baltimore, unfortunately, and New York and Chicago, Richmond is still at the 15, 16 mark for both 20 and 2021. So not the big spikes we've seen in other cities. And we think it's because of the sustained role that this program has had. At the same time, we've seen, we don't say this is the sole cause, but we've seen poverty go down, unemployment go down. Of course, some of this has changed, of course, in the last couple of years because of COVID. But the reality is that when an Office of Neighborhood Safety can prevent gun violence and prevent a shooting or prevent a gun homicide, cities, counties, and states, and all of us benefit. We benefit because those people are still with us and provide, contribute to society, but it's also high cost. Policing and the response to gun violence is a major cost for local governments. And what we've shown here is that in 1 year alone in Richmond, the Office of Neighborhood Safety prevented 16 firearm incidents. This was a case where one of their street outreach workers literally got in the middle of a conflict where guns were drawn and mediated it and stopped that shooting from happening. If those 16 shootings were just with an injury, that saved City of Richmond about $6 million. If those would have been homicides, closer to $15 million in 1 year. Now the cost of the whole program, the budget, is $1.2 million, which pales in comparison to the $70 million that the police are getting every year in Richmond, and even more in probably your city. So thinking about the economic benefits of peacemaking and healing is also a powerful argument to bring this work to many communities. But it wasn't just about gun violence. That was important, but it's also about job creation and reducing energy poverty. And Richmond did that as well. A program called Richmond Build, also through the city, sponsors young people, often from public housing, to get trained to be electricians in solar installation. And they've done many hundreds of homes and multifamily units for free solar power, creating jobs and reducing the economic burden, which can be a stress, of course, for low-income and immigrant families. And the last example is what I call a case of urban acupuncture, back to the Iron Triangle. And there was this little park in the Iron Triangle called Elm Play Lot, which was used to be a place where people would come together. And young people found that it was overrun. This was the park about 12, 13 years ago. It looks pretty typical and looks pretty nice from this perspective. But the reality was it was not used by young people. People did not feel safe. The housing around it was abandoned and boarded up. There was people letting their dogs run free, and they were threatening kids. There was graffiti, there was drug dealing, there was violence. The community and a neighbor, here's Tony Lee, a leader and community member, said, we're going to take back this park, and we're going to organize, and we're going to create a new vision for this park and what it can and should be for us and our community. And she helped mobilize residents and brought folks together to say, what can we do here? And engage the city, because it was a city park, and said, we want things to change. And they created an organization called Pogo Park, and created what they called, many of us call a pop-up park, where they didn't fully build it out, but they just sort of took it over and went to Home Depot and put in some temporary structures and temporary things, and got young people and the community to come and play there and see how people use that space. Much like many of our classic urban parks were developed, including Central Park in New York, where people watched how people moved through the space and used it and then designed it, as opposed to having our landscape architects and planners design it from their office and then implement it with a play structure and things that don't reflect maybe the local culture and the community. And in fact, that play structure that was there in that I just showed in Pogo Elm Play Lot had been paid for by the city and brought in by a playground firm and built, and again, not utilized. So they came up with this vision, the Elm Play Lot community vision. And it was about active spaces, but also healing spaces, places where there were gardens and what they called a chill zone, a contemplation area now has a little waterfall, like a meditation garden, but also places to play and barbecue and have people come together recognizing the different cultures of the community in their global village. And the most important thing they recognized was something, of course, we as planners should always pay attention to. Well, the two most important things. One was food, of course, we know is the most important, but second is a bathroom, a safe bathroom in a public space that's clean, that's usable, that's accessible by all. And those were their two priorities in the planning process, but they were places not just of activity, but of interaction. And importantly, like in Medellin and like in, I mentioned in Nairobi, residents were hired as part of the Pogo Park organization to build this vision, to build this space. And they built it and they were invested and they continue to manage and maintain the park on an everyday basis through both contracts with the city and through private funding. So they're maintaining the fence, they're keeping it clean, they're running programs, Zumba classes, and importantly, they identified we need a place that's multifunctional. This was a house that they purchased next door to the park, and they renovated into an office, a community kitchen, the bathrooms, and now they give out food to thousands of young people every day through a contract with the county government of an after-school and summer feeding program. And so there's multiple things happening in this space, what they call the heartbeat of the neighborhood. There's play, there's jobs, there's food, there's safety, and importantly, for healing, this social connection, culturally responsive social connection for folks to come together in this space. And it's an ongoing process, an ongoing project. It still needs to be maintained and updated. And local people are doing that. Local people are hired to do that. And they continue to thrive. This is the worst slide. I should never put this up. I tell my students to never to do this. So I'm violating every principle I've taught my students with all this text. But I thought this quote was very powerful from a publication called the East Bay Express in the San Francisco Bay Area about how they describe Richmond's Renaissance. And I'll wrap it up with this quote, that this new spirit in city government transforming this formerly industrial city and its grim reputation, changing the narrative, I think, is also an important part of what all of these communities have done about their cities, from the most violent Medellin to Richmond as being a toxic and industrial and unhealthy place, etc. Citizens participating, unprecedented numbers, including also private sector engagement. Economic opportunity is critical to combine with the place design and the social supports and programs. It needs to happen through partnerships with economic opportunities and local government. And Richmond's produced a balanced budget, complement of police officers. The combined departments of community members have resulted in meaningful reductions in violent crime. And they've completed many numerous civic and neighborhood revitalization projects that have given Richmond a new era of vitality and community health. So let me wrap up there, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A of the overall argument for the book of Cities for Life, how communities can recover from trauma. So we need to continue to focus on what it means to co-produce expertise for analyzing, assessing challenges, and generating interventions. Too often, we default to our professionals without valuing local knowledge with communities, not on or for them. We need to identify in every place where we're working those toxic stressors that are the result of this trauma of planning and poor policy making. We need to identify them, which you need to do with community members, and reduce those traumas. Too often still, and of course, our current situation is a great example where we're focusing on one risk factor, disease, or behavior at a time. Can we just reduce a threat to one disease, or get people to change their behavior or walk more, or whatever it might be? This is a mistake. We need to think about this integrated, the overlapping stressors that many communities face. Instead of focusing more broadly in our planning processes, we need to start with this idea of urban acupuncture, focused equity projects, investments that support people and places in the hardest hit, most vulnerable communities. And what we have seen is the entire city benefits when you do that and do it well. They're not one-off projects. We need to learn by doing, but we need to have ongoing investment. The Office of Neighborhood Safety has now hired its outreach workers in Richmond as full-time city employees with stable job and benefits. That is how you reduce gun violence, not a 2-year program by a foundation or an experimental nonprofit only project. Can work with nonprofits, but they need the long-term support to do this well. We need to evaluate and adjust, measure what we're doing as we go, but don't over-surveil or over-survey communities that have already been experimented on and over-researched. And finally, all of this, I think, contributes to a new vision of what we mean by urban science and urban health science, how we define sustainability, who's involved in data collection and defining our policies, and holding those institutions accountable who have helped create the traumas and who must now also be participants in focusing on rebuilding for health and healing. Thanks, and I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Jason. And we'll have you go ahead and turn on your camera for the rest of this. And we'll go about another 35 minutes to 2:30 Eastern. I know it's still morning, California, where Jason is today. And thank you to everybody who has sent in very thoughtful, excellent questions. I'll probably jump around a little bit. Obviously, they come in as you're speaking, and so often it's in response to the specific examples you were talking about. But I'll try to move it around a little bit just so that we can continue to ask the questions from all the great examples and efforts that you're talking about. So the first question here, I'll just ask is more specific than maybe some of the other ones, and that is, so the Office of Neighborhood Safety is not located in the police department, but is more of an executive office reporting to senior management?
That's correct. And it was consciously not connected to police. And in fact, many cities, including Richmond at the time, had a program called Ceasefire, which some of you may be familiar with, which is partnering with police. And they said, Ceasefire does what it does, but it doesn't reach the young people who we think are most vulnerable, most likely to be victims of gun homicide, and distrust the police and institutions to the point where, for good reason, to the point where a program that had an affiliation with the police would not reach them. So ONS made a conscious decision to not work with police, but that does not mean they don't work with local government. They do, and they're obviously they were originally housed, I think, in the city manager's office. Now they're in something, they've done a reorg, and it's, I think the Department of Community Services or something, which has like, engineering and parks and the library and some other things, and they're within that suite of organizations. So yeah, the long answer to no, ONS is not part of the police department, and it was a very conscious decision to not be and to remain separate from the police department.
Okay, thanks, Jason. I'm just going to dive in here. Next one here's from Joe Beth Heyman, who says, many of these initiatives require resources and imagination, often an imagination that elected leaders have trouble championing. In particular, we are struggling to get more support for ideas like an Office of Neighborhood Safety among the majority of our council in our city. Do you have any recommendations for how to get leadership on board to create cities for life?
Yeah, I mean, particularly now with this crisis in many cities, and maybe your own city and your own community of gun violence and violence during the pandemic, I think what people may be more open to creative ideas. I think looking at both some of the research and evidence that shows that these kinds of programs, the Office of Neighborhood Safety, the Advanced Peace Program, another one that's called Cure Violence, which is very similar, where they use outreach workers really to focus on a public health approach, which is about healing communities and those at the center of violence to turn things around. So there's some good evidence, some we've produced, which I'd be happy to share, to show that this delivers results. It also saves money, like I talked about, and most importantly, helps healing for those at the center of violence. So using that evidence, but also maybe inviting in the worker, the people who do this work in places like Richmond and Stockton, California, Fresno, California, other cities. New York City has a program. I believe Baltimore had a Cure Violence initiative at one point. And I'm not sure if it's still in place. But so I would say sometimes elected officials feel like their place is so unique and their politics are so difficult and resources are so constrained. Talk to somebody from another place, another community, and how did they go about doing it? The reality is Richmond's program and many others that we've looked at with this advanced peace model, which grew out of ONS, the annual budgets are quite small, and the cities that are doing this invest sometimes less than 500,000 a year. For example, Sacramento has done this program, and I think only put in $250,000 a year, which is nothing for city government. So I think it's more about a commitment, like you say, and what does a city really want to do? How do they want to value their most vulnerable populations? And it's a value judgment rather than an economic case.
Okay, thank you. Next question here is from. Okay, absolutely. We'll just keep kind of going through. There's probably some overlap with some of these questions given the nature of the topic that you're talking about and the examples, but I'll just keep asking them. So the next one here is from Jennifer Joseph, who says, how common is the Office of Neighborhood Safety? For example, was this a product of your project or do they exist elsewhere? And could this be a kind of template for other cities that are looking for community responsive programs to address environmental justice and equity concerns?
Yeah. So a couple pieces, I guess, to that response. I mean, the short one was, no, I didn't create the Office of Neighborhood Safety. It was part of a suite of strategies that happened roughly around the same time in Richmond in response to both gun violence, poor health, environmental injustice. And I was involved in those different planning processes. The ONS was the vision of, I mentioned a man named Devone Bogan, who now runs an organization called Advanced Peace. So he ran the ONS for, I think, a decade and then said, can we take this model nationally and internationally? And that's what Advanced Peace is now doing. The important thing that we recognized was that, gun violence reduction was seen as a public health issue, was seen as a community development issue, was seen as needing community expertise and community members to generate right solutions, not the role of law enforcement, not the role of just external experts, not the role of just academics or nonprofits from outside. So that was the connection, that we connected the Office of Neighborhood Safety to the range, the suite of things that happened, and they're connected. For example, they need what they call and what we call a kind of a constellation of services. So it's not a one-off thing, but the Office of Neighborhood Safety has some of their young people do internships and jobs at Pogo Park. So those projects are connected, or to another organization I talk about in the book called the Rise Center, which is a youth-led community center, which does a whole host of things for young people. And they're very closely connected with the ONS. So the idea is that even though it's within the city, as a city agency, the ONS, it's connected and integrated to nonprofits and community development activities because we see those things as connected. And that was part of what we helped bring. Our team at Berkeley is an integrated vision, what we call this kind of relational view to thinking about healthy communities and healing communities. Is you can focus on people and not on the place. You can focus on the place and rehabilitate neighborhoods, but if you don't support the needs, the healing needs of intergenerational trauma, those places may not deliver what they potentially could. So it's about both and that's what we have done and continue to try to do in Richmond. Now, like I said, Richmond was the first to develop an Office of Neighborhood Safety. I believe there's 30 or more now across the United States. They're often called OVP, Office of Violence Prevention, and they have similar characteristics. I can't say they all look exactly like Richmond's ONS, but they're growing, and I think that they're an interesting model to look at in any city as an alternative to law enforcement to reduce violence and help communities heal and recover.
Great, thanks, Jason. Next question here is more related to land use and physical planning. Regarding the provisions of housing, like shelter for low-income groups, how much have cities done through the spatial contribution of lands for affordable housing and shelter in the many support efforts ongoing, besides meaningful community spaces like the parks that you mentioned?
Yeah, I didn't mention too much. I mean, in Nairobi, for sure, they have focused on housing and building housing. I think it's one of the gaps in Medellin, to be honest with you, that they have focused more on public space and transport and community facilities and education, all critical things, less on housing, leaving that more up to maybe individuals. Of course, we have competing ideas or theories about how to build more and create more affordable housing as a social housing or public housing or not. But so I think those have been looked at differently in the different political and economic contexts of Nairobi and Medellin. And in Richmond, it's also interesting because it's one of the few places in the San Francisco Bay Area that is not experiencing the same pace and intensity of displacement and gentrification that we see in other places like in Oakland. So there's still affordable housing for immigrants, for folks of color, et cetera. It's the quality of that housing, it's the quality of the services in the neighborhoods. And the thing that I think in all the examples we've tried to emphasize, and I would say that this would be the land use and housing response, is that too often in planning, we have a bunch of people focused on housing, but not at the same time focused on the economic development that people need to be able to pay for that housing, to pay even subsidized or low-income housing for the utilities and for the rent and for the other things we need to survive day to day. So again, thinking in a more integrated way that we need healthy community development, which includes an attention at the same time to shelter and housing as it does to the public space, as it does to economic opportunity and job creation. Again, that's why in Richmond, we didn't mention today, but in the book, I talk a little bit about a housing rehabilitation and construction program that the city co-sponsored, that's also with a bank financing, where they're actually building housing and rehabilitating abandoned housing with local people getting paid to do that construction. So everything from energy upgrades to full remodels. And then they resell those houses to local residents at below market rate. And there's a social impact bond that they use to support that work. And I don't want to go into too much depth here, but there's material from the Richmond Community Foundation, RCF, online that you can find more about how this is structured, and also talk about it. And there's references in the book, in the chapter on health and all policies in the book. So again, I think it's a great question. Housing has been one of the bigger challenges and probably the limits of some of the cases, but it is being addressed. It's of course different in the different contexts, but it's got to be integrated, not seen as separate from economics or environment or health and community development.
Great, thanks, Jason. Next question here is from Chloe Moore, who says, often there's a stark inequality between a city town with mostly low-income residents and a suburb or surrounding township with high-income residents. Cities and towns with large populations of low-income residents often struggle to provide basic services and don't seem to have time or attention for the types of improvements that you're describing in Richmond and Medellin. Are there examples of wealthier municipalities or suburbs helping lower income ones? And are there ways to get the attention, money, and time of the government leaders for public improvements in communities that are struggling to provide basic services?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And of course, the US planners on the call will know that, having regional planning has been a struggle in this country for at least a century or more, meaning that, looking less at, all these little fiefdoms, all these little towns and cities having their own, being able to provide, controlling their own land use and their own services. But we do, in some ways, have some regional services. We have utilities that are often functioning at the region, whether it's water or sewer or electricity. Transportation, of course, is another good example. So it's not as if we can't do it, or that regions and the wealthier suburbs don't see that they're related and connected to some of their poorer neighbors. So it does happen. It's a struggle, of course. Everybody's competing often for scarce resources and for, maybe tax rates for land and other related things. So I think there's two responses. That yes, there are examples. They're not a lot, but there are examples. There's a trend, like in Richmond, in some cases, of what we call municipalization, which is the idea that privatized sectors of the economy or utilities, like energy or water or a whole host of things, get reclaimed by local government. So Richmond's unique in the Bay Area in that it doesn't contract with Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, the largest regional utility, but contracts with, basically broke away from that and contracts with something called Marin Clean Energy for its energy. So it has much more flexibility and can control rates, can control the service in ways that they aren't subject to this massive utility. So the idea that, and in Medellin, also the city owns or is partnered with the utility that controls all the water, sewer, internet, electricity, phone, communications. But by law, they passed a law that says 30% of their profits have to go back into social programs. So the idea is that you can use existing structures more creatively to generate resources to ensure that those services and those supports get delivered. Breaking down the political and administrative boundaries between all these local governments is going to be a challenge. So the other thing is that many of the examples here were done with very low or minimal resources to start to generate improvements, and sometimes that can then attract resources that are maybe unfamiliar to planners or local government, but are more familiar in the public health world, like through foundations or the National Institutes of Health, or grant writing, things like that, that can give local authorities, often in partnership with community organizations, additional resources outside their budgets to do things more creatively. And that can then show, hey, this can work. We can actually do this, and we can do it efficiently. That's what happened in Nairobi, in a place with very little resources, almost no resources. There's small experimental pilot projects, and proved to the county and eventually the central government that Kenya could do this, even with its major debt and economic issues, that providing some of that basic infrastructure, life supporting infrastructure, was possible and really didn't cost that much. So I guess a long way of saying, interrogate the assumptions around those connections between the wealthier suburbs and the more vulnerable communities. Look for opportunities to innovate and do more low cost, what we call kind of low hanging fruit, things that could show and prove that this could work, and explore other options for funding, and then challenge existing budgets. They're often way out of balance, particularly when we look at how much we're spending on things like law enforcement compared to what we're spending on some of these other life supporting services and infrastructure, social and physical infrastructure that we need in our communities.
Thanks, Jason. Next one here is from Brittany Crone, who says, changing the narrative is so important. In Indianapolis, there is much renovation going on. However, much of the media is still focused on gun violence reporting. How can we work with media outlets to convince them to help us rebrand the narrative?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think rebranding the narrative and changing the narrative means you've actually got to have stuff to show that it's happening. And it's not always physical. I mean, I think, understanding the people in Indianapolis or in a neighborhood in Indianapolis, what's their perception of what's happening? You can have all this development, but are they actually benefiting? And we've seen many cities attracting outside development, building big office parks or medical centers, and very little of that benefit is going to the local community. I mean, even in Richmond, there's a big, the Kaiser shipyards created the Kaiser health system, which many may be familiar with. They have a big hospital right in the center of the Iron Triangle, surrounded by big iron fence, 10, 12 feet high. And because if you're not a Kaiser member, which very few people in the community are, you can't use that hospital. I mean, sometimes they even turn away people at the emergency room and say, hey, go to Oakland or go somewhere else, because they don't see that as a life or death situation. So even when we have these big anchor institutions, these big community development projects, they're not speaking to the needs of the local community. And so I think changing the narrative means understanding what are those needs and having community members speak for themselves, speak about, are these projects working for us? And if not, what needs to change? What do we need? Most of these development projects aren't employing local people, or a very small percentage is written into those contracts to hire local or whatever. But it's maybe construction related, but not in an ongoing way. Or the ongoing way is they're doing the service and the janitorial work, but not getting trained and opportunities to do the higher level skills jobs that they could definitely do and ought to have access to. So it's thinking about, what's the specific projects that are happening in Indianapolis, thinking about who's controlling that narrative, are the voices of community members being heard, and what we've done also is to try to build an evidence base to counter the narrative that, either things are working or they're working for certain people and not for others. And again, that's got to be done with, not on or for, the local community. So bringing that to the media and doing, now we can do our own social media campaigns. You can generate a lot of traffic and knowledge about what's happening using social media, not relying on traditional, maybe traditional news outlets and things like
that. Okay, thanks, Jason. We had several questions around this topic, and that is, how did Richmond finance all of the work that they did?
Yeah, so there's no one response to that. I mean, I think the early work was financed in large part by some foundations. So, for example, the California Endowment created a Building Healthy Communities initiative and selected Richmond as one of its 14 communities around the state of California. Now, most of those resources went to community-based organizations to build their capacity to participate in a visioning and implementation process for what does a healthy community look like in Richmond and the other places where the endowment funded organizations. But we're talking initially like $100,000, $150,000 per year. They did fund a temporary position in the city of Richmond. City of Richmond doesn't have a health department. Its health supposedly is taken care of by Contra Costa County, the county which is quite big and stretches from Richmond to the east, that includes fairly wealthy communities. So it wasn't exclusively focused on Richmond. So Richmond got some money from the California Endowment and hired like a health and wellness coordinator. And that enabled the city to create the first health element or chapter in its general plan, which was the first time that had been done in California. It's not required by law. And that set in motion a whole series of policies and initiatives that now had a vision, again, of here's what we want to do, here's the policies, here's the implementing partners. Sometimes it's community organizations, sometimes it's local government, it's partnership. And that enabled the city to think, well, do we allocate public resources to this? Are we able to go out and raise additional funds from that? I mentioned before something called the Richmond Community Foundation, which is a small community foundation that's in Richmond that also helped fund some early projects. And as momentum built, and this is, I think, key for all the cities, that a partnership between community organizations and local government was created. And that partnership led to putting proposals together to the state of California, to the federal government, to get significant resources to do the kind of major infrastructure changes, whether it was parks or streetscapes, or in the case of moving from Richmond to Nairobi, to the infrastructure, but even also to rehabilitate housing. Those are tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars that were made possible because there was a vision and a plan and a partnership that was created through these processes between the community, a respectful partnership, and local government. Now, I argue in the book, and I'll say it here, that none of this work can happen on the backs of nonprofits or foundation funding, meaning philanthropy, even the deepest pocket private funders alone. It's not going to happen. It can only happen, in my view, and the three cases I look at, a key take home is that partnerships, both practice and planning partnerships, but economic partnerships between community and local government, and often utilities and others that have resources, need to be created. And that's what happened in Richmond to fund these projects. Pogo Park eventually, started with a $50,000 grant from the city through the California Endowment to do design work, and they've over the last couple of years been able to do joint proposals to the state of California and the U.S. Department of Transportation for $20 and $30 million to change streetscapes, to improve neighborhood conditions. And they've gone to private sector like Google and others to get millions of dollars to start a community land trust, to buy up housing, to stabilize the housing market around the park and in the neighborhood. So there's resources out there for all of these projects, even in the lowest income communities that I talk about. But accessing those often demands these partnerships, and then of course creating a vision with an evidence base to be competitive for those proposals or for those calls for resources.
Thanks, Jason. Next question here is from Rachel Scudder, who works in Vermont, and she's asking, is there any precedence for this type of work in rural America? We are starting to integrate health in all policies into our region, but I think looking at precedents elsewhere could be a good place to start.
Yeah, I mean, I'm less familiar with that, but I think for sure that a lot of the principles and ideas that are adopted, whether it's in Medellin or in Richmond, for example, come from more rural communities. They come from cultural practices that don't rely on whether they're urban or rural. They come from Native American practices, like the ONS uses things called healing circles, where they bring young people together to talk about trauma and violence. Health in All Policies really looks at an integration strategy of both across governments of different scales, but also different community and nonprofit partners. So I don't think it's unique to the urban space. There just happens to be a lot of these stressors and traumas concentrated in our cities, particularly in our urban neighborhoods. I think it's too inaccurate to generalize about cities, but really to think about neighborhoods, which to me then lends itself that this idea or approach, the principles are applicable no matter the scale, the density, or where you are in the world, because It's really about building healthier communities. And there can be a community of 20,000 people or a neighborhood. I mean, I grew up in New York City. My neighborhood was 150,000 people. Now that's the size of Richmond, California. That's the whole city. So, you know, I think, but the principles of engagement, of meaningful partnership, of community members working to, analyze their situation, collect information, generate solutions, implement those solutions, thinking about integrating these strategies across multiple layers of government. They're not constrained whether it's a New York City or Baltimore or Chicago or Richmond or, somewhere in rural Vermont. I think, of course, the questions and challenges and institutions will look a little bit differently, but the principles, I think, and I believe, apply, and they would be the same. I'd be happy to talk more about that offline, about specific challenges in your place.
Thanks, Jason. And Jason's email is up on the screen now for anybody who wants to contact him directly. Now we're getting towards the bottom of the hour, but we got so many questions. I'm just going to ask a few more and then we'll wrap up here in the next few minutes. So the next question here is from Sharon White, who says, have you worked on any projects that were specific to emotional safety in the public right-of-way that supports spaces free of harassment and discrimination?
Yeah, I mean, I personally have not, but I know that our partners, for example, in Richmond and in Medellin, and even in Nairobi do. So I've mentioned the activism by women in Nairobi and also in Medellin. Many women were the leaders and continue to be the leaders in these projects. They don't disconnect, and maybe the thrust of your question is the same, like the interpersonal threats that they might feel in a street or in their neighborhood, or why, for example, women don't feel safe riding bicycles as much as men do, even when the physical infrastructure for non-motorized transport is great, and we see that around the world. So they don't separate those things, and they really push organizations and local government, and continue to push to think about both. And so, yes, I need to feel safe, my individual safety, and what that means for my emotion, and maybe going back to a place that may have been threatening or had a threatening experience, while at the same time changing the conditions long term. So it's kind of that both the people and the place idea that I was mentioning, that we can't focus just on one or the other, particularly when we've got populations and communities like I mentioned that I present in the book, but I'm sure you're talking about, or many folks have seen. People need supports. It's like they need the counseling, the support, the care to get through the day. That's critical. But if we stop there, we're just going to continue to support individuals and not change the conditions around which they go back into. So that's what these partnerships, that's what involving community organizations who think about these connections, and local government, often forcing them to think about those connections, to engage simultaneously and sort of in an integrated way with that local healing, that individual healing. So for example, in Richmond, the ONS does provide individual counseling for those who need it, from trauma, cognitive behavioral therapy, anger management, a whole host of things. But at the same time, they're working in partnership to change the conditions in those neighborhoods that those young people go back into, and to change the dynamics and the threats that they may be facing in their neighborhood. So it's a both and I think too often in planning, we've left the individual to a different field, or in public health, we've forgot about the place and left that to planners, and we haven't worked together. And this is really a call for more collaboration, more integration, and more innovation across those different kinds of fields and approaches.
Thanks, Jason. Just a couple more here. Much of what you've addressed are critical elements for resiliency, which is such a hot topic these days. Can you talk about how your research can inform resiliency efforts?
Yeah, great question. I started doing more on this topic. I mean, I think resiliency, as you mentioned, I think I totally agree. It's it's the new like sustainable development, or it's the, whatever the new buzz term is. I think though the principles of equity and inclusion and transparency need to be placed at the center when we talk about resiliency. Much of the climate resilience work, and I have a lot of great colleagues who are doing this work, does not pay attention to healing and trauma and health. It's really about physical infrastructure, flooding, weather events. It's important. But if we forget about the people, we're missing a big part of the puzzle. And if we forget about the people's expertise and what they bring, people have been, thriving and surviving sometimes in very difficult circumstances. In fact, all the neighborhoods and all the examples I just talked about that appear in my book are great examples where there's already resilience. That's the default in many communities. We don't need a new field of resilience. We need to talk to folks who have figured this out under very difficult circumstances with very little resources. And not to romanticize it, but to say if we ignore their knowledge and expertise, we're going to miss out on what the field of resilience planning, sustainable resilience, whatever we're going to call it, can and ought to be. Inclusive, with equity at the center, with healing and health at the center, rather than outcomes later on. We need to think about that up front. And of course, those voices and expertise of local people who are already resilient. I mean, that's the default again for these communities, unfortunately, and it wears on folks. But value that, respect them, support them, and pay them for that knowledge to bring into this new resiliency planning efforts.
Great, thank you. I guess the last question, and we could definitely go at least as long as we just did, going through the rest of them. But the last one here is from Jeanette St. Pierre, who asks, what inspired you to do this work and study this public health issue?
Yeah, well, I guess that's another hour and a half. But
pretty broad
I mean,
question, right?
Yeah, a lot of it was just from my own experiences growing up, my frustration with the field of planning as a student at MIT, where I studied planning and nobody was talking about public health or healing, even though it's core to our field. So I went to public health and no one was talking about place or planning or city environments, but it was core to our field. So I said, what's going on here? So that was part of the inspiration, but I think the bigger part was when I was a practitioner in New York City government, for example, working in the South Bronx, growing up in Upper Manhattan and the Bronx, going to Brooklyn and working with communities that were struggling, and seeing that they had solutions and expertise to offer. And so those were examples. And then being invited into the communities I talked about in the book and staying there for over a decade or more in each place. So really trying to be a partner rather than just a parachuter who comes in and out. That's been inspirational. And fundamentally, the reason that drives me is the people and the people that I've met and the friendships I've made and the communities that I respect. And like I said, that really technical term, love. And we need to continue to, from my perspective, see that humanity and seeing their humanity. And that drives my work as both an academic and a practitioner.
Great, thanks, Jason. And we'll send you the rest of the questions that were received. And thanks to everybody for submitting them. And that was a great point you just made. But is there any other takeaways you'd like as closing thoughts today to share?
No, I think that's it. Great question. Sorry I couldn't get to more of them, but be in touch. This is challenging work. I gave you a high level, quick and somewhat dirty summary of things that have taken a decade or more to happen, with lots of fits and starts and challenges along the way. So it's hard work, but it's critical, important work. Thanks for listening.
Great. Thank you, Jason. And with that, we'll conclude our webinar today, Cities for Life, How Communities Can Recover from Trauma and Rebuild for Health. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to Jason Corburn for a great presentation, to everyone who attended, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those of you who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate or participation if you need that to claim other continuing education credits that are not AICP. Please look up for this follow-up email in the next day or so if you need this certificate to claim those credits. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. And finally, keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including From Complete Streets to Complete Networks, a data-driven, performance-based multimodal planning tool with our colleagues from the Michigan Department of Transportation, which will be next Thursday, February 3rd at 1 p.m. Eastern. With that, I wish everybody a great day.